Hey guys, Tournament Scrabble has been around for the better part of 50 years, which is a lot longer than many folks realize. Now, I've been playing for about 14 years, which feels like a long time, but in the scheme of things, it really isn't. Throughout the nearly 5-decade history of Tournament Scrabble, several people have emerged as legends of the game by virtue of their accomplishments both on and off the board. One name that probably comes to mind is Nigel Richards, who I've been fortunate enough to play 3 times in tournaments. One of my most memorable games against Nigel was even featured on my channel in a video a couple of months ago. Nigel is widely regarded as the greatest Scrabble player of all time in terms of raw skill and talent, but Nigel is certainly not the only Scrabble legend. Another legend is Joe Edley, who's a 3-time North American champion and has been a top expert pretty much since the dawn of Tournament Scrabble. I've been fortunate enough to have Joe as one of my mentors throughout the years, and we've played what must be hundreds upon hundreds of Scrabble games against one another. Joe was recently featured in one of my videos about a fascinating endgame he played against Jerry Lerman, another longtime top expert. But another person who needs to be included on any list of Scrabble legends, and who, at least until today, hasn't been featured in any of my videos, is David Gibson. David began playing Tournament Scrabble in the 80s, and very quickly rose to the ranks of top experts. He would ultimately go on to win 2 North American Scrabble championships, but he was famous for a lot more than that. David pioneered a uniquely defensive style of Scrabble that, while unconventional, gave him great success and caused even other top experts a lot of trouble throughout his career. He also is the namesake of the term Gibsonization, which most tournament players watching this video are probably familiar with. When you're Gibsonized, that means you are mathematically a lock to win the tournament. So let's say you're up 2 rounds on the field, but there's only 1 game left in the tournament. You cannot be caught, so you're guaranteed to win the tournament, and the term that is used in Tournament Scrabble is Gibsonized. That's because David was so good that he did this so often. There was a point where it felt like every tournament David played, he would have won the tournament before the tournament was even over, so to this day, whenever someone accomplishes that, they say that they have been Gibsonized. Besides being a fearsome and challenging opponent to play over the board, David was also one of the most kind and gracious people you'll meet in Tournament Scrabble. Years ago, when I was 16, David was nice enough to invite me over to his home in South Carolina for a couple of days, where we spent a bunch of time together and played over 30 games of Scrabble. I only got to play David once in tournaments, at the 2016 North American Championships held in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Thankfully, it was a fun and interesting game, and it's the one I'm going to be featuring in today's video. Sadly, David passed away from cancer 5 years ago, almost to the day. It was a huge loss for the Scrabble community because, as I mentioned earlier, not only was David one of the best Scrabble players of all time, he was also one of the nicest people you could look forward to running into at a Scrabble tournament. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this game. Once again, the only tournament game ever played between myself and the late Scrabble legend David Gibson. This was round 28 of 31 at the 2016 North American Championships, so as you can imagine, it was a very important game. David, as he had been for the majority of this tournament, was at the top of the standings, and was trying to cement his lead going into the final 3-game day. I was a couple games back and couldn't really win the championship at this point, but with a strong finish, I could easily finish 3rd or maybe even 2nd, so I had a lot to play for as well. I was first in this game with an opening rack of EEIMNSU. It's a promising looking rack, but doesn't quite make a bingo. I played Emu for 10 points, keeping the super strong EINS sleeve. I played Emu here, as opposed to a couple spots up, putting the U on the star, because with my play, the S hook is stronger. This way, if I hook Emu to make emus and I bingo, I'll hit one of the double word scores and my bingo will score more. So with the S in hand, I opted for the more aggressive placement. David, with IILORTX, responded with XI for 24 points. This looks like David's best play by far on equity, and it also fits into his trademark defensive playstyle I was mentioning earlier, not really giving back any counterplay. And I draw well, pulling AEINSTU, which makes 2 7-letter words, aunties, and sinuate. I could play either of them with emus, scoring 70 points. I quickly discarded sinuate with emus as a viable option, because with sinuates and sinuated both being valid, it gives David a ton of potential counterplay down the rightmost column. Aunties with emus is probably the most standard choice here, but I decided instead to sacrifice a point playing aunties with sex for just 69 instead of 70. Now, my motivation for this decision was almost exclusively based on my opponent. Remember, as I was mentioning earlier, David thrives on closed boards, and I had a ton of respect for David's ability to outmaneuver me on a closed board, even if he started at a little bit of a deficit. I felt that if I played Aunties for 70 down here, that the board was starting to gravitate towards the bottom part a little bit more than I was comfortable with. If I play Aunties up here, then I open tons of bingo lines on the top part of the board, where the emu's hook still stays open, so it's going to be very hard for David to close off this board in its entirety. That is the main reason why I played Aunties here, giving up a point. Against the vast majority of players, maybe even against anyone other than David, I would have played it for 70. But because I was playing David Gibson, I decided to give him the respect of being the master of closed boards and try to force the board open by playing Aunties over here instead at the cost of 1 point. On David's next turn, with a rack of ILNOPRT, he made a very interesting play. He played Pot and Sext for 22 points. This is definitely not the standard play, as ILNR, while not a terrible leave, isn't the strongest. Equity-wise, he's much better off playing Lip for 21 points. It gives up 1 point, but NORT is a much stronger bingo leave than the LINR that David keeps with Pot. I'm not exactly sure why David did this. It might be in part because at a deficit, he was feeling a bit more inclined to keep the board open despite his normal playing style, and Pot does open a line for 7s down the K column. It might be in part too because David wanted to block the T in Aunties, which is a very dangerous bingo line as it would be a double-double. Lip, unlike Pot, leaves that T open, and with a second T on his rack, David might feel he's the significant underdog to hit that T, and thus this position doesn't really favor him. Maybe that's why he played Pot. Unfortunately, I'm not exactly sure. It's also worth mentioning that I think a lot of players here, especially at an early deficit, might favor a play like Tropin for 26. This turns over more tiles, giving a better chance at drawing one of the blanks, and it also creates a lot of volatility with Tropine with a back E hook also being valid. This also completely leaves open the top part of the board. In fact, if I were in David's position here, this is probably the play I would have made because I would have wanted to dig into the bag and leave the board as open as possible for a comeback. So, very interesting here that David instead decides to play Pot, sacrificing a few points, keeping what doesn't seem like the strongest leave, but still playing a modicum of defense while keeping some opportunities open for himself. What's really cool is I think this is a play that I certainly wouldn't make, and probably the vast majority of other top experts wouldn't make. But David made this play with confidence, and I'm sure he had his reasoning, even if it's not exactly aligned with what I'm saying, and that's part of why David was such a good player. He knew how he liked to play, he knew the kind of Scrabble he was good at, and he stuck to it. In any case, after David's play of Pot, I was faced with a fairly awkward-looking rack. 3 sets of duplicates, 2 Gs, 2 Os, and 2 Rs. Thankfully, David's play actually gave me a lifeline, because I was able to play Gyro, overlapping all 3 of his letters, forming as well the 5-letter sexto, scoring 28 points, and unduplicating all 3 of my tiles that I previously had 2 of. So this was a fairly easy play for me, and one I was very happy to see available after David's play. David drew another I and a Y, not exactly what he was looking for, but he does pull the S, which is going to be valuable for trying to bingo with emus. He plays Linny for 24 points, which looks like the clear play here. It's best by a good margin on equity, scores pretty well, and keeps IRS, which is a very strong 3-tile leave. I have a 7-letter bingo here, which doesn't play on this board. I decided to play short with OV for 26 points, keeping AEGRT. There are a bunch of reasonable options to consider here, the top 3 of which are my play, Fog for 23 next to Gyro, hooking Go and Pig. This sacrifices 3 points, but gets rid of the G, which is not a great tile, and also Fetor for 33 points through the T and Aunties. This scores the most, but gets rid of the E and the R, which are both very strong tiles for bingoing or just balancing the rack. I eventually chose OV, because my rack felt a little bit too strong to blow up with Fetor, and I didn't actually mind the G so much. It goes pretty well with the R, as well as the A and the E. This sleeve didn't feel all that much worse than AERT. So I decided to grab the extra 3 points. I think this is a reasonable decision. David draws 3 E's out of the bag as well as an H. He doesn't have an available bingo here, so he plays E for 24 points at the top of the board, keeping the strong leaf of EEIRS. All else being equal, he'd probably rather not keep a second E, but he doesn't really have any better options here, and if he can just draw 1 or especially 2 consonants, he should be in good shape to bingo with emus on his next turn. I drew an E and a V out of the bag. I don't have any playable bingos here, and now I settled on veg for 19 points above the L and I in Linny. This looks reasonable here. There really aren't any plays that score more points than this, and this keeps the best leave I can. So that way, if David does bingo, hopefully he'll give me some floaters or another line I can use to bingo back myself. David did indeed bingo with Resiled for 72 points. It's worth noting he actually has another much flashier bingo here of Elderly's, a 9-letter word from the EL, but it's clearly worse. It only scores 61 points, which is 11 less than David got for Resiled, so a no-brainer here for him. He played this pretty quickly. And he takes the lead by 14 points, 166 to 152, and unfortunately for me, I have drawn the dreaded Q. Fortunately for me, though, I have a very easy decision since I can drop it for 31 points with Chi and not have to deal with it anymore. I did this very quickly in response, retaking the lead for now. David draws 3 E's once again, as well as the J, an L, an N, and an R. And he has some options here. He can score the most by actually keeping his J here and playing Needler through the D in Resiled, hooking Sexto again, this time to make Sexton. This is definitely not the type of play that you want to make here, and especially not the type of play that would appeal to David, because it creates not just one, but 2 big S-hooks, Needlers as well as Sextons. Needle is an option that doesn't create a big hook on the bottom triple word line, but it still creates a lot of back hooks with Needled, Needler, and Needles all being valid. So this play also a little bit too volatile for David's tastes here. He also probably doesn't really want to keep the J, as there aren't a lot of good scoring spots for it on this board. So instead, David elects to get rid of it immediately, playing Gier for 26 points under the R and E of Resiled. Now, interestingly, David actually got a little bit of criticism for this play, but I think it was mostly hindsight bias given what happened, as we'll see on my next turn. This is exactly what I would have done if I were in David's position as well. Like I said, I think it's important for him to get rid of the J, and something like Needle or Needler on the right-hand side of the board feels a little bit too reckless. I think this is very reasonable on this board at a more or less tied game. Now, the reason that David maybe regretted this play is because it gave me a spot for my only bingo now of Arietta for 72 points. If David didn't play here, then my bingo would not have fit under the R and E of Resiled. Just another reminder, guys, that in Scrabble, it's very easy to have hindsight bias. But as with any game of chance, just because a play doesn't work out absolutely does not mean it wasn't statistically and mathematically the best play. I still believe that Gier was David's best play. Didn't work out here since it gave me a spot for my bingo, but again, that doesn't mean it was a bad play, it just means it didn't work out in this particular scenario. I think there are far more scenarios where things don't work out well for David after the much riskier plays of Needle or Needler. It just so happens that here, my bingo of Arietta would have happened to not fit after either of those plays, but it did after Gier. So a lucky break for me, but definitely does not mean that David made a mistake. And he did draw a blank after his play of Gier, however, he does not have any playable bingos here. David's highest equity play here of Hayen for 34 points under the last 4 letters of Arietta is way too dangerous, because even though doesn't take an S in this lexicon, he could potentially give back a huge score under the TE and AN on the bottom right triple word score if I have, say, a W or other high scoring tile that goes after TE. Heel in this spot has the same issue. So instead, David sacrificed a couple points playing Alb for 25 points. This looks like a great play on his part. EHN blank is a fantastic leave. He still scores pretty well and doesn't give me any counterplay. Another option too would have been in Halo for 30, getting 5 more points, but given David already has the blank, I like the sacrifice here. You keep a better leave, and when you have a blank, it's good to prioritize leave because you want to try to bingo as soon as possible, not risk having the blank for multiple turns until you get to play it. So I like this play for David. And I draw this rack here, and I find what I believe is my best play by a good margin. I use the O that David could have used, but I think correctly chose not to on his last play, playing Modulo for 30 points. It does open a new bingo line from the M, while I do have a lead, but I felt that with my lead not being that large, only about 40 points before my play, and 2 blanks and 2 S's still unseen at this point, there were enough other ways that David could come back that it wasn't a good idea for me to start playing defensively. And again, that especially applies given I'm playing David Gibson, and even with a bit of a lead, I was worried if I started sacrificing too much, David would find ways to outmaneuver me on the closed board, and catch up, possibly without even bingoing himself. So I like the aggression here. It's also just my best equity play by far. And David here strikes. With AEH NSV blank, he makes a fantastic play. He has one bingo here that scores 100 points, which is much more than any other option. And he finds it and plays it quickly. Vahines down the L column, making Guy, Pin, War, and Sextos. A very nice 4-way overlap, and he jumps back into the lead, 317 to 285. And on my next turn, I made my first significant mistake. It's worth mentioning, this was the first turn of the game where I actually felt like I was in trouble. After my early bingo, I'd been holding on to a respectable lead for a while, and I felt pretty good about how the way the game was going. But that immediately changed on just one turn after David bingoed for 100 points, not only erasing my lead, but taking a 32-point lead himself. To make matters worse for me, my rack was a bit clunky, IINOOWZ, and I also didn't have an S to hook either Eras or Arietas. The one remaining S and one remaining blank were going to prove pivotal for the outcome of this game, and I didn't have either. David also just drew 7 tiles from the bag, so he had a decent chance at picking one of them up himself. So because of all that, and again, given who I was facing off against, I felt like I was at a big disadvantage here, and decided I needed to take a big risk. As such, I played Wazoo for 34 points through the A and Vahines, completely blowing open the right-hand side of the board. Now, this does score pretty well, and get rid of some of my clunky tiles, but it gives David access to a huge scoring spot with an O in the middle of 2 triple word scores. Much smarter in this position would have been a play I didn't see, Zowie for 38 points. This play scores 4 more, doesn't create such a huge opening for David, and also unduplicates my I's. This keeps I and O, which is significantly better than the 2 I's and an N I keep after Wazoo. This is really not a good play since David is likely to block the O while scoring a lot of points and maintaining a healthy lead on an increasingly closed board. This was a little bit too panicky and short-sighted, but like I said, that was one of David Gibson's strengths. He was so feared on these kind of boards that even without a big lead, people would feel an urge to force open the board when they didn't need to, and David's strength was capitalizing and pouncing on those openings when they happened. So once again, guys, a big mistake for me here, playing Wazoo instead of the safer and higher equity Zowie. Let's see if I got punished. In a very lucky break for me, David drew quite poorly out of this pool. He not only didn't pull an S or a blank, he pulled a bunch of tiles that really don't go well together. A, B, C, D, G, T. This is an extremely challenging turn for David because while he'd obviously love to use that O to score well himself and also stop me from playing there, he just really doesn't have any good plays through that tile. His best equity play is the extremely reckless bag for 16 points under the A in Arietta. Not only leaving the O completely open, but creating 2 new threats on the bottom for plays through the G as well as under AB. This play, while reckless, isn't necessarily wrong. There is some logic to the idea of opening a second spot, so that way, if I use any spot on this board, David is guaranteed to have access to another spot himself. Definitely not David's style, though. David ended up playing this word to the O for 15 points. It's actually been expurgated since this game happened, but back in 2016, this was a valid play. While it does take out the O, it leaves a very bad leave on David's rack, A, C, D, G, T. These consonants really don't go well together, so even with a good draw, David's going to be hard-pressed to score a lot of points, let alone bingo, on his next turn. So he's really giving up quite a lot in terms of the future potential of his own play to take out the O for me. Is it worth it? It's really hard to say. Another option he could consider besides this play and the super reckless bag is Zag for 22. It scores 7 more than his play and also gets rid of the G, which is a bit worse than the B. Now, that being said, it completely leaves open the O, which is very scary, so I understand why David didn't want to do this. He could also try to play off a couple more tiles while mostly obstructing the spot, maybe something like Goad for 12 points. It doesn't completely block, though, because I could now, of course, start something with a vowel and play down the O column next to the D in Goad. So this play is not perfect either. There's really no perfect play here. In fact, there's no play that looks particularly promising. Other very lackluster options for David might include playing bag here for 13 points, giving up 3 points over the other bag we looked at, but of course not opening 2 triple word scores in the same aggressive way. He could even consider exchanging tiles here. I know it sounds crazy because this rack isn't all that bad, but with the blank and the S so pivotal and the pool strong, it might not be the craziest idea for David to just trade 7 here and go all in on trying to draw those tiles. All of David's reasonable options that play tiles on the board only turn over like 2 or 3 tiles, so that's going to significantly decrease the chances that he gets the valuable blank and S as opposed to me. So I'm not saying I would do it, but I think trading 7 is actually not as crazy as it looks. In any case, David decided to make this play, which is definitely most in line with his strategy, and as we'll see, David's instinct in this position was correct, as it so often was, because I drew extraordinarily well after Wazoo, pulling not just the S, but also the blank out of the bag. Super, super fortunate. My clutchest draw of the game by far. And David did indeed stop me from tripling here. Inositol through the O, which I saw and was prepared to play, would have scored 122 points. The amazing thing is David actually opened the possibility for me to make a 10-letter word here, and I saw it almost immediately. Abolitions for 83 points. And as tempting as it was to play this, I also quickly knew that it was not the best play, and that the option of monistic for 80 from the M in modulo, which I had seen while David was thinking, I figured that David was going to block the O, so I decided to spend the time that David was thinking on his own clock trying to come up with backup options. Monistic from the M was that backup option I generated. And why did I know that this was going to be better? After all, abolitions does score 3 more points. It's 83 as opposed to 80 for monistic. Well, here's the thing, guys. If I play abolitions, then David could still bingo from the M in modulo. And while the S and blank are gone, there are still some decent bingo tiles unseen to me. You've got some A's, some E's, an I, N's, R's, and a T. So definitely well within the realm of possibility that David bingos from the M on his next turn and retakes the lead. Now, the key thing to notice here, guys, is that because I drew both the S and the blank, neither of them are remaining in the pool. There are no more S's or blanks that David could possibly have. So that means that eras and arietas are out of the question. As such, if I use the M myself and play monistic, there's basically nowhere left on this entire board for David to bingo. With no S-hook, and also no ability to overlap monistic because the C doesn't make any 2-letter words, really the only spot where David could bingo is starting from the O in Wazoo with an 8-letter word. There are some much more unlikely lines, like an 8 through the J in Jeer, or a 10 of his own from the play he made earlier, but those are extraordinarily unlikely, if not nearly impossible. So after monistic, David's bingos are almost exclusively going to be from the O and Wazoo. And if he bingos there, which also isn't that likely, and O isn't the easiest tile to start with, 2 things. Thing 1, it's not going to score that much because David won't be occupying a double or triple word score. Thing 2, any play there is likely going to give me significant counterplay on the triple word score at 08, or possibly, if I draw a longer word, the triple word score at 015. So if David does bingo from the O and doesn't score that much, and I can come back with a large play, I'll still have a healthy lead at that point. That's the thought process behind monistic here, and that's why I believe it's a significantly better play than the bingo of abolitions, the 10-letter word that's far more stylish, but style points don't matter here. It's the North American Scrabble Championship. You gotta maximize your percentage to win the game. It's not about who plays the flashiest 10-letter words. It's about who wins. And because of that, monistic is the play here. And now, mostly through my good fortune, David is now in a major pickle. He played very defensively on his previous turn, which made some sense there because it was an even game. It would have been hard for him to foresee me getting both the S and the blank and bingoing in a way that not only blocked the M, but didn't open anything else for him on the left side. Monistic was more or less the worst possible scenario for David. But now the problem for him is he's down by 67 points. That's not a deficit that even David Gibson is realistically going to make up on this board this late in the game, especially with a rack as clunky as ACDDGTU. And as I was just mentioning, there are really no good places on this board for David to bingo. In this position, David more or less threw in the towel playing Zag for 22 points. He told me after the game that he felt at this point there was just no chance for him to win, so he decided he wasn't going to open anything for me and not give me a chance to further pad my margin of victory, since spread could have still been important for him at this point in the tournament. I do think here that David missed a bit of an opportunity to give himself a good enough chance that it would have been worth risking some spread. Doug for 13 points under the A of Arietta. With this play, David would fork the board, creating not one but two different lines where he could bingo. One of which is on the bottom row, hooking a D onto add to make add with two Ds. He could definitely end a 7-letter word in a D, especially if he draws one of the two remaining E's. The other line is, of course, playing through the G in Doug on the rightmost column. And if I don't have an I or an O, it's actually going to be impossible for me to block both of these lines. Because if I don't have the I or the O, I can't actually play under the G of Doug, with Gi and Go being the only valid 2-letter words there. There are also no hooks other than the O remaining in the unseen pool to add, so I can't play something on row 15 that might obstruct both spots. If I play something through the G, then that's not going to stop David from ending a 7-letter word in a D. So I'm going to have to make a decision here. And from David's perspective, he's hoping I block the G, because ACDT doesn't go well with a G, but it goes great with a D hook, especially if he can draw an E. But remember, I don't know what David has, so David's hoping that from my perspective, I see the G as a bigger threat, which is very plausible. With two N's and an I left, I could easily think David is going for an ING bingo, or maybe an AGE triple triple with a bunch of A's and E's still unseen. So I might think, alright, there's just one D left. If David doesn't have the D, he can't hit row 15. I'm going to block the G, and if I do that, maybe David draws Crafted or something on row 15 for nearly 100 points and comes back and win. Is this likely to work? Probably not. But I think it works enough of the time that if I were in David's position here, I would have given this a shot and not quite thrown in the towel yet. But in any case, David played Zach here for 22, and at this point, I pretty much knew the game was over. The unseen pool was garbage. There were only 2 vowels left and 12 consonants. As you guys can see on the right, 2 C's, 2 D's, an F, 2 N's, an O, a P, 2 R's, a T, a U, and a Y are the 14 tiles unseen to me. So 7 of these tiles are in the bag, 7 of these tiles are on David's rack. Regardless of which are the 7 on David's rack, he is going to have garbage. And I was aware of this, so I knew that as long as I didn't open anything for him, that I was safe here. I played weak for 29 points, not opening anything. This doesn't take any hooks, and AEI is actually a fantastic leave here because the pool is so consonant heavy. I'm super likely to draw 3, if not 4 consonants on my next pool. At this point, the game is over. David draws extremely poorly once again after Zag, pulling another C out of the bag. He plays Kruk for 19 points. At this point, throwing in the towel makes a lot of sense. I don't see any play that gives him any mathematical shot at winning if I play sensibly, so this seems reasonable. I respond with a nice overlap here of Piney for 49 points, getting Wept, Edit, and Nah. David plays Yond for 24, and finally I go out with Raj for 10 points, finishing with a win by a score of 501 to 397, so a 104-point margin. Despite the fact that this wasn't that close a game on the scoreboard, it was over a 100-point margin, it was a really interesting and tough game. We both had a lot of challenging decisions. I, for my part, definitely didn't play perfectly, especially with the Wazoo turn, but overall I was very happy with how I performed in this game. I also definitely got a lot of luck. In particular, I was unjustly rewarded for my mistake of Wazoo with that draw of both the S and the blank. So I'd say I definitely had the upper hand over David this game in terms of the luck. David definitely made a lot of unconventional plays this game, as early as Pot and as late as ABO and Zag. So really cool here that we had David's full racks and we got to see some of the unconventional but also very insightful Scrabble play he was known for and he used to propel himself to one of the best Scrabble careers of all time. So that's it for this one, guys. Really hope you enjoyed this video. Of course, major shout out to the late, great David Gibson. It was always a pleasure getting to see him and play him. Really appreciate his kindness and everything he did for the game. And thank you all so much for watching the video and supporting my channel. I really appreciate it, and I will see you all soon for the next video. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.